Have you ever felt like you're just not enough? Like no matter how hard you try, you're still the least, the last, the one no one bets on? Maybe you've looked around and seen others succeed, others stand strong, others lead, while you hide in the shadows, weighed down by fear, doubt, or a past that whispers lies about who you are. If that's you, if you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or simply too weak to matter, then stop scrolling. Because what you're about to hear is not just a story from ancient times, it's your story too. In the next few minutes, we're going to uncover the mystery of why God chose Gideon, a man who called himself the least in his family, from the weakest clan, hiding in fear, and transformed him into a mighty warrior who changed the destiny of a nation. And by the end of this video, you won't just know why God picked him, you'll begin to see why he might be calling you next. Now, lean in close for a second, because what I'm about to say could shift the way you see yourself forever. You didn't land on this video by accident. There's a reason you're here right now. Deep down, you're searching for something, maybe hope, maybe purpose, maybe just the answer to the question that's been burning in your soul. Why would God use someone like me? Well, you're going to get that answer right here, today. So don't click away, don't let this moment pass, because we're about to unlock something powerful, something real, something that speaks straight to your heart, your struggles, your journey. This isn't a lecture. It's not a sermon. This is a story that will grip your spirit and refuse to let go. And it all begins with one unexpected man threshing wheat in a wine press. Let's go back thousands of years, to a time when the people of Israel were living in deep fear. They were being crushed by an invading force, the Midianites, who swarmed their land like locusts, stealing crops, livestock, and hope. Imagine trying to grow food for your family only to have it ripped away season after season. Hunger wasn't the only enemy. Shame, helplessness, and spiritual confusion filled the air. People cried out to God, wondering if he had forgotten them. And in the midst of that chaos, we meet our main character, Gideon, not on a battlefield, not in a palace, but hiding. Literally hiding in a pit, threshing wheat in secret so the enemy wouldn't see him. No armor, no weapons, no confidence. Just a man scared for his life, trying to survive another day. Can you picture that? Can you relate? Maybe you're not facing Midianites, but maybe you're fighting silent battles that no one sees. Financial pressure, anxiety, family problems, self-doubt. You wake up every day putting on a brave face, but inside, you're just trying to make it through. That's exactly where Gideon was. Weak, worried, wounded. Yet in that lowest moment, something divine happens. A messenger from heaven shows up, not to rebuke him, not to mock him, but to speak a destiny that seems completely opposite of his current reality. The Lord is with you, mighty warrior. Wait, what? A mighty warrior? This guy? The one hiding? That sounds crazy, right? But this is where it gets real interesting, because God doesn't see you as you are. He sees you as you were made to be. He speaks to the warrior inside the weakling. And just like that, Gideon is pulled into a battle that will not only change his life, but reveal a side of God we rarely talk about. The God who chooses the unlikely, the underdog, the scared, the insecure. Why? That's what this entire story is about. And trust me, the answer is going to challenge everything you think you know about God, about strength, and about yourself. Now, let me ask you something personal, and be honest with yourself here. Have you ever said, God couldn't use me? Have you ever looked at your past, your flaws, your fears, and disqualified yourself from anything great? Maybe you felt like the black sheep in your family, the quiet one in your friend group, the person others overlook. That's exactly how Gideon saw himself. In fact, when the angel called him a mighty warrior, Gideon literally replied, "How can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." He had already decided his worth. He had already written his story, and it ended in failure, in fear, in silence. But God had other plans. And here's the twist you didn't see coming. The same God who called Gideon is still calling people like him today. People like you. People who've been hiding. People who've believed lies about who they are. God is in the business of flipping the script. He didn't choose Gideon because he was strong. He chose him because he was available. And that may be all God needs from you too. Not perfection, not power, but availability. But there's something else too, something deeper, something about Gideon's heart, his honesty, his questions, his wrestling with doubt. And in the next part of this story, we're going to see how that very struggle became the key to his calling. Friend, you've made it this far because something inside you is hungry for more. For truth. For hope. For purpose. That's why you can't stop now. What happens next will not only explain why God chose Gideon, it will show you how your weaknesses might be the very thing God wants to use for his glory. We're about to enter a powerful moment in Gideon's journey, the turning point, the battle, the breakthrough. But before we do, there's one thing you need to know about Gideon's first step of obedience, and trust me, it didn't come easy. In fact, what God asked him to do first might just be the hardest thing anyone could be asked to do. And that's where we're headed next. But before we go there, what if you were Gideon? What if your breakthrough was closer than you think, but it starts with one uncomfortable act of faith? Don't go anywhere because what happens next will blow your mind. Before we jump into Gideon's defining moment, the point where everything shifts, you need to understand where he came from and why he was so deep in hiding to begin with. See, it wasn't just fear that drove him into that wine press. It was years of watching his people suffer while God seemed silent. The Midianites weren't just an ordinary enemy. They were ruthless invaders who came like a storm every harvest season. They'd sweep through the land, not just taking food and animals, but leaving behind a broken spirit among the people. It was like a cycle of defeat. Every time something good started to grow, it got snatched away. Can you relate to that? That feeling where every time you get a little hope, life hits back even harder? That's the mental space Gideon was in. That's the pressure he was carrying, not just for himself, but for his family, for his entire tribe, who looked around and saw no answers, no protection, no future. And here's something even deeper. Gideon wasn't just battling physical fear. He was facing a crisis of faith. His ancestors had told stories about the mighty works of God, the parting of the Red Sea, the plagues in Egypt, the miracles in the wilderness. But where were those miracles now? Why had God allowed their enemies to take control? These weren't just questions of survival. They were soul-level doubts. Maybe you've had some of those too. Moments where you asked, if God is real, then why is this happening? That's the kind of bitterness Gideon carried inside, hidden behind his quiet obedience. He did what he could to help his family, yes, but hope? That was in short supply. Now, let's look a little closer at Gideon's world, his relationships, the people around him. His father, Josh, was a respected man, but not necessarily a righteous one. Their household, like many in Israel at the time, had compromised their faith. They had altars built to Baal and Asherah, foreign gods brought in through cultural influence and desperation. It's subtle, but this detail matters. It tells us something about the spiritual atmosphere Gideon was raised in. A mixture of tradition and corruption, truth and idolatry. Imagine growing up in a home where people speak about God but worship convenience, comfort, and compromise. That confusion, religious on the surface but empty at the core, left Gideon torn. How could he trust a God his father had seemingly abandoned? And then there's the people in his town, the community he lived among. On the surface, they looked like fellow Israelites, but something was off. Their loyalty had shifted. When things got hard, instead of turning toward God, they chased after what the surrounding nations offered. False security, false gods, false promises. It's like they forgot who they were. Or maybe they just got tired of waiting. That subtle spiritual drift created an atmosphere where no one truly stood for anything anymore. Everyone just tried to survive. Gideon was surrounded by people who had settled into defeat. They accepted oppression as normal. They didn't expect deliverance anymore. They just hoped to avoid pain. That mindset, that culture of compromise, is exactly what God wanted to confront through Gideon. But here's where things get murky. There's something unspoken, something hidden in this town, something that doesn't quite add up. The moment Gideon starts asking questions, starts challenging the way things are, the people's reaction is almost too intense. When he tears down the altar to Baal, They don't respond with curiosity or concern. They react with rage. Almost like they're afraid. Not just of losing their false gods, but of what those gods might do in return. That fear, that sudden shift in behavior, it raises a red flag. Why would a people who supposedly belong to God be so furious when someone removes an idol? Unless there's something else going on. Something darker. Something buried. And just like that, we begin to sense that Gideon's battle isn't just with outside enemies. It's internal. It's among his own people. Maybe even within his own family. Now think about that. What if the real enemy was a Midian? What if it was the fear that lived inside the people? The lies they believed? The things they clung to even when they were killing them slowly? Gideon's calling wasn't just to fight an invading army. It was to confront a spiritual infection that had crept in over years of apathy and fear. But here's the twist. Someone doesn't want that infection exposed. The moment Gideon takes that first step, tearing down the idol at night because he's too afraid to do it in daylight, he unknowingly sets off a chain reaction. Old alliances start to crack. Secret loyalties begin to show. People he trusted become suspiciously quiet. And maybe, just maybe, there are people in his village who are benefiting from the way things were. People who had made deals with the enemy. People who didn't want freedom because captivity gave them power. And that's when the real mystery starts to unfold. Who can Gideon trust? Who's truly with him? And who's playing both sides? You can feel the tension rise. The same community that's been crying out for deliverance suddenly turns on the one man brave enough to act. It doesn't make sense, unless you realize that Gideon's actions were more than symbolic. They were a threat, a challenge to the status quo, a shaking of the spiritual system. And in that shaking, secrets start slipping through the cracks. You start to wonder, who helped build those altars in the first place? Who encouraged the town to follow Baal? Who might be whispering warnings in the ears of the townsfolk, telling them Gideon's the problem, not the answer? See, this story isn't just about a man fighting an enemy. It's about what happens when truth confronts deception, when obedience confronts tradition, when light starts to shine in places that have been comfortable in darkness for too long. And Gideon, he's walking a dangerous path. The same people he was trying to protect might end up turning against him. And as for the angel who called him a mighty warrior, well, that title is starting to feel like a setup. Because the weight of that calling is only getting heavier. The questions are multiplying. And the next step? It's going to cost more than Gideon expected. What if there's more at play than just Gideon's fear? What if the very people around him have something to hide, something they've buried for years? And what if the reason God chose him, of all people, was because he was the only one still willing to question it all? The only one naive or brave enough to push back? Stay with me, because what happens next will shatter everything Gideon thought he knew about his people, his family, and even himself. The morning after Gideon tore down the altar to Baal, the entire village felt different. Not just tense, but haunted. People walked around with eyes that darted left and right, as if they were waiting for something terrible to happen. Gideon had acted in secret, under the cover of night, with the help of a few servants he trusted. But by sunrise, the altar was nothing but rubble. The Asherah pole beside it was gone, and the town's sacred space had become a battlefield for the unseen. Whispers flew like wildfire. Who did it? Who dared defy the gods they had honored for years? And then, just like that, fingers started pointing. Not based on facts, just fear. Suspicion. And one name kept surfacing, Gideon. That was the first sign something was wrong. He hadn't left any trace. No one had seen him. So how did they know? That's when the warnings began. At first, it was subtle. A few elders pulled Gideon aside, speaking in low tones, cloaked in concern but heavy with threat. "You've done enough," one of them said, resting a firm hand on his shoulder. "Let it go now, before you stir something that won't stay buried." It was meant to sound wise, protective, but Gideon could feel the fear behind it. Or maybe it wasn't fear, it was control. The kind that wants to keep secrets sealed and wounds from being exposed. Something about the tone, the timing, and the tension in their eyes told him there was more going on here than just broken idols. Someone knew what he had done before anyone should have. which meant someone had been watching. And that someone had a lot to lose if Gideon kept digging. Later that day, Gideon went back to the site, hoping to gather anything left behind. He didn't know what he was looking for. Maybe proof that God was still with him. Maybe something that would help him understand why the village reacted with such panic. But when he arrived, everything was gone. Not just the altar, everything star. The stones were hauled off. The wood was burned or buried. Even the spot where the altar once stood had been scrubbed clean, as if the townspeople had tried to erase the memory entirely. And the strangest part? No one would admit to cleaning it up. When he asked around, they shrugged, looked confused, played dumb. But someone had worked hard, fast, to cover it all up. And Gideon couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been there, it wasn't just symbolic. It was important. And now it was gone. That night, something even more unsettling happened. One of the servants who helped Gideon with the altar disappeared. No goodbye. No trail. Just gone. His name was Malek, and he was young, maybe 17, eager to serve but cautious by nature. He had been nervous even before they started the task. And now no one could find him. When Gideon asked Malek's father, the man wouldn't even make eye contact. He muttered something about Malek leaving to work for another village, but the way he said it didn't add up. His voice was hollow. His hands were shaking. It was like he had been warned not to speak. Or worse, he knew something Gideon didn't. And then there was Eliab, a longtime family friend, someone Gideon had grown up with and trusted like a brother. Eliab had always been bold, the kind of man who spoke his mind and laughed in the face of fear. But when Gideon came to him for advice, Eliab's demeanor was different. Cold. Distant. Not angry, but guarded. He said all the right things, but something in his eyes betrayed him. They flickered with guilt, or maybe regret. "You've stirred the hornet's nest," he told Gideon, his voice low and hard. "I just hope you know what you're doing." It wasn't what he said, it was what he didn't. Eliab had been a vocal critic of the Midianites, always talking about the need for change. But now that change was actually happening, he was backing away. Almost like he knew this wasn't just a spiritual battle, it was personal, maybe even political. Maybe Eliab had a history with the people who propped up those idols. Maybe he had his own secrets to protect. Piece by piece, it all started to come together, but not clearly. There was a pattern forming, but the picture remained blurred. Someone had tipped off the town. Someone had cleared the evidence. Someone had made Malek disappear. And someone, possibly Eliab, was working both sides. But who? And why? The fear in the village wasn't just about Baal. It was about what Baal represented. A system. A shadow network. A false peace bought with quiet loyalty. Gideon wasn't just confronting a religious symbol, he was exposing something much more sinister. And that's when a detail from the past came to light. A name Gideon hadn't heard in years. There had been a strange event when he was a child, a fire that burned the outskirts of their town. The adults never spoke about it. No one was ever blamed. But Gideon remembered the smell of smoke and the way people acted afterward, anxious, divided, like something had happened they weren't allowed to talk about. Now, as he dug deeper, he started hearing whispers about that fire again. That it wasn't an accident. That something had been hidden in those woods. Something tied to the altars. And maybe, just maybe, that's when this secret first began. A betrayal no one ever named. A wound the town covered with silence. And here's the twist. Someone else remembers the fire too. Someone who approaches Gideon quietly, in the middle of the night, with information that could change everything. But before this mysterious figure can speak more than a few words, they stop. Their eyes widen in terror. They mutter, "They're watching," then vanish into the darkness without another word. Gideon is left standing alone, heart pounding, mind racing, and one step closer to a truth more dangerous than he ever imagined. Whatever is buried in this town's past, it doesn't want to stay buried. The air grew colder after that night, though not in temperature, but in spirit. Gideon, still reeling from the half-whispered warning and the figure's sudden disappearance, couldn't sleep. Every shadow outside his home looked like a figure lurking. Every creak in the wood felt like a footstep nearing. But what disturbed him more wasn't fear. It was the feeling that he was being watched, followed, manipulated even. Like someone or something was orchestrating his every move, feeding him just enough to stay curious, but never enough to feel safe. And then came the next ripple. Gideon's younger brother, Jether, normally quiet and absorbed in his work, approached him just after dawn with a look on his face Gideon had never seen before, part alarm, part disbelief, and something else, betrayal.
Jether had found something.
Hidden inside a stack of old tools behind their barn was a sealed wooden box wrapped in worn linen, buried beneath layers of dust and time. At first, he thought it was nothing more than an old family chest, maybe filled with farming records or long-forgotten heirlooms. But when he cracked it open, he found a bundle of old scrolls, sealed with a wax imprint neither of them recognized. It wasn't the symbol of Yahweh. It wasn't even the markings of the Midianites. It was something older, something they hadn't seen before. And hidden among the scrolls was something worse, a small golden idol, no larger than a child's fist, wrapped in black cloth. Jether had stumbled on a secret their father had never spoken of, a past that neither of them was prepared to face. The implications were staggering. Josh, their father, the very man who had tried to defend Gideon from the townspeople after the altar was destroyed, had clearly been involved in some kind of hidden worship, one not even tied to the public ball rituals everyone saw. This was private,
Secret.
protected, and hidden for a reason. Gideon wanted to confront him right then and there, but Jether stopped him. Because just after discovering the box, Jether had received a message. Scrawled on a torn scrap of hide, tucked under the latch of the door where only someone with stealth and intent could have placed it. For chilling words, he knew.
So will you?
That was it. No name. No explanation. Just a warning or a threat. But it changed everything. Someone else knew about the box. Someone was watching them both. That's when the story fractured. Up until this point, Gideon had thought the conflict was between him and the enemy. The Midianites, the town's idols, the cultural decay. But now it was clearly more tangled. If their father had a secret past that involved ancient worship and hidden relics, then what else was being kept from them? Was Gideon chosen by God to lead the people because of his humility, his fear, his honesty? Or was he being used to clean up a legacy of corruption within his own bloodline? The possibility hit like a weight in his chest. What if this battle had never been about deliverance alone, but redemption? What if this was a reckoning that began years before Gideon was ever born? And the people around him, those he trusted, those he thought he understood, began to blur at the edges. Jether, though loyal, had grown quieter since the discovery, and something in his eyes suggested that he was hiding even more than he had shared. Maybe he'd seen the symbol before. Maybe he had overheard Josh talking about it when he was younger. Either way, Gideon could tell that his brother was carrying more than he let on. Meanwhile, Eliab reappeared after 2 days of silence, suddenly warm again, overly friendly, too much so. He brought bread, cracked jokes, and acted like the tension between them had never happened. But Gideon's instincts were on high alert. Eliab's change in demeanor wasn't natural. It was like a mask, too perfect, too smooth. As if someone had told him to calm things down. As if someone was trying to draw Gideon back into trust, just long enough to trap him. And then the contradictions began. The scrolls they found in the box referenced a meeting place, an ancient grove just beyond the village's edge, near the cliffside where shepherds rarely ventured. But when Gideon and Jether went to investigate, the grove was scorched. Not burned from a recent fire, but blackened by something long ago. Trees were split unnaturally, as if struck by lightning, and the earth beneath felt dead, cursed even. And yet, hidden among the ashes was a remnant, one small stone, engraved with the same strange symbol from the wax seal. How could a place mentioned in scrolls so old still bear fresh marks of its power? How could something buried in secrecy still pulse with influence today? The truth was no longer just a matter of faith or courage. It had become a puzzle of time and memory, of past sins bleeding into present purpose. And just when Gideon thought he might be able to start connecting the dots, something happened that shattered the little trust he had left. One of the scrolls, the one that mentioned the grove and hinted at a covenant of silence made by the elders years ago, went missing. Not misplaced.
Gone.
Vanished. They had left it hidden in their home, sealed again for safety. But when Gideon returned to retrieve it, the box had been disturbed. Nothing else taken. Nothing else touched. Just that one scroll, the most revealing one. Which meant only one thing. Someone close to him had taken it. Someone who knew exactly what to look for. And someone who wanted to make sure Gideon didn't read the next line of truth. So now the mystery deepens. The stakes are personal, ancestral, and potentially deadly. With every clue uncovered, another vanishes. With every step forward, the ground shifts beneath him. Gideon no longer knows who to trust, what to believe, or whether this calling is truly divine, or a trap laid generations ago. But the real twist? Just before the section of the scroll disappeared, Gideon caught a glimpse of a name written in its folds. One that shook him to his core. It wasn't the name of a Midianite. It wasn't the name of a known elder. It wasn't even a name he had heard in passing. It was his own.
Gideon.
Written in ink that looked too fresh to be decades old. Which begs the question, how could his name have been recorded in ancient scrolls? Unless someone had been expecting him all along. The next morning, the village was wrapped in fog. Not the kind that gently rolls in from the hills, but a thick, choking veil that seemed unnatural, like it had been pulled over the town by something with purpose. The light couldn't break through it, and the air tasted metallic, as if the very atmosphere had soured overnight. Gideon stood in the doorway of his home, heart pounding, breath shallow, with a creeping sense that everything had changed while he slept. The weight of the missing scroll still pressed hard on his chest, and the name, his asterisk name, burned in his mind like a brand he couldn't remove. He didn't know how it got there or who had written it, but one thing was becoming terrifyingly clear. He wasn't just uncovering a mystery.
He was the center of it.
He hadn't slept. Every creak in the night sent him to the window. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps outside. But what confirmed his worst fears wasn't just a sound, it was silence. When he knocked on Jether's door that morning to share a theory that had kept him up, there was no answer. The room was empty, the bed untouched, and all of Jether's belongings were still there. But his brother was gone. Not just missing. Vanished star. The kind of disappearance that didn't leave clues or witnesses, just questions. And a strange smell lingered in the air, like burnt cedar and iron. Gideon stood frozen, feeling his stomach drop, unable to tell if this was coincidence or a calculated move. Either someone had taken Jether, or Jether had discovered something and fled without a word. Both possibilities were equally horrifying. Panic wrapped itself around Gideon's spine like a serpent. He ran to Eliab's home, desperate for some kind of stability, someone to confirm that he wasn't imagining all of this spiraling out of control. Eliab answered the door, but something in his eyes was different.
Darker.
Less human. He said Jether had probably gone to gather wood. That maybe he just needed space. He smiled too long. Held the door half-closed behind him, like someone was listening on the other side. And when Gideon tried to press for more, Eliab laid a hand on his shoulder again, just like the elder had done days ago, and said, almost whispering, "You're asking too many questions." Not "we're worried for him," not "let's go find him," just that, an echo of the warning Gideon had already heard, spoken this time by a man he once trusted like family. That was the moment he knew.
He was alone in this.
That afternoon, Gideon ventured to the grove again, despite the memory of the scorched trees and the heavy dread he had felt there before. He had to find answers. Had to believe that maybe Jether had gone there too, looking for clarity. But as he approached, something stopped him cold.
Footprints.
Not just his own, but several. Fresh, pressed deeply into the softened earth, too large to be his brother's. They circled the grove, paused near the engraved stone, and then simply vanished. No trail in or out. Just sudden presence and sudden disappearance. He dropped to a knee, inspecting the tracks, and that's when he saw it. A single feather, black as night, perfectly placed on the center stone. Not blown by wind.
Set.
deliberate, and beneath it, carved faintly into the stone, deeper than before, were the same 4 words Jeter had received. Asterisk he knew. So will you, asterisk. The weight of those words hit him harder now. They weren't just warnings, they were promises. Or threats. And they were closing in fast. As he stared at them, Gideon felt the world tilt. A sudden ringing filled his ears, his vision blurred at the edges, and a wave of nausea crashed over him. He fell backward, gasping, the feather now clutched in his palm. When he looked up, the trees seemed taller, the shadows thicker, like they were leaning in to listen. Or worse, to whisper. He stumbled back to town just before sundown, shaken and disoriented. But the fear didn't end there. It only deepened. Because that evening, as he sat in the corner of his room, trying to piece everything together, a low rustle echoed near the window. He froze, listening. Nothing. Then again a scrape. He lunged forward and pulled the curtain back, but no one was there. Only a single mark etched into the outside of the window pane. 3 claw-like lines carved into the wood. Not random. Not made by accident. It was a sign.
A mark.
A message left by someone or something that had been just inches away from him while he sat in silence. Watching him. Marking him. Paranoia was no longer a feeling, it was his reality. He couldn't trust anyone. Couldn't sleep. Couldn't even think straight. Every sound, every face, every old story now carried the weight of suspicion. How deep did this go? Was his family involved more than he realized? Had Josh hidden more than just a box and scrolls? Was Jeter part of it too? Or had he been taken as a warning? The fear wasn't just about who was behind it anymore. It was about what it was. Because this wasn't just political. It wasn't just historical. There was something darker at play. Something ancient. Something that had waited in silence for generations and was now rising, one shadow at a time. And as Gideon sat there, still clutching the black feather and staring at the etched marks on his window, he knew this was no longer just a mystery to solve. It was a game of survival. And the rules were written long before he was ever born. It was just after midnight when everything Gideon thought he understood shattered beneath the weight of a truth too twisted to predict. The village had gone quiet again, the kind of silence that doesn't soothe but unsettles, where the night feels like it's holding its breath. Gideon hadn't meant to go back to the altar ruins, not after everything, but something pulled him there, something instinctual, like a whisper in his bones guiding his steps. The altar, once a battlefield for belief and defiance, now sat cloaked in silence. Only the foundation stones remained, scattered like forgotten bones. As he sifted through the rubble, hoping to find something, anything, that might help him make sense of the scrolls, Jether's disappearance, or even the black feather still tucked in his cloak, his hand struck something solid buried beneath the dirt. It wasn't a scroll or relic. It was a box, smooth and dark, sealed shut with a clasp that hadn't been rusted by time. It hadn't been there during the first destruction. This was new, recent, planted. Inside was a folded parchment, brittle but recently handled, and a small object wrapped in crimson cloth. He didn't recognize the object at first, but when he pulled back the layers, his stomach turned. It was a ring. Not just any ring, his father's. Josh had worn it every day, a family heirloom passed down through generations. Only now, it was scorched at the edges and marked with the same strange symbol from the stolen scroll and Grove stone. Beneath the ring, the letter revealed a truth that twisted the entire story. It wasn't addressed to Gideon. It was addressed from him. A letter, written in his handwriting, sealed with his family's mark, dated 3 years before Gideon ever received his so-called calling. The words were haunting. This must be done in secret. No one must know until the time is right. If the covenant is broken before its purpose is fulfilled, the chosen will fall before he rises. Gideon fell backward, breath ripped from his lungs, mind spiraling. How could he have written a letter from the past, especially one he had no memory of? Was it forged? A trick? Or had he been part of something before all of this even began? Something hidden from his own memory? Suddenly, It wasn't just the enemy he didn't recognize. It was himself. And the more he stared at that letter, the more pieces began to rearrange in his mind. Jether's disappearance wasn't random. It was tied to this. Eliab's warnings weren't betrayal. They were protection. The scroll with Gideon's name hadn't predicted the future. It had recorded a deal. A covenant made long ago. Desperate for answers, Gideon ran to the one place he had avoided since his brother vanished, Joshua's private workshop. The door had always been locked, always off-limits. But now, with everything unraveling, the boundaries no longer mattered. He broke through the rusted latch and stepped inside, bracing himself for old tools and meaningless clutter. But what he found froze him to the floor. The entire room was a map. A hand-drawn diagram of the region, marked with symbols, notes, times, names, all connected by red thread pinned between scrolls and charcoal sketches. At the center was Gideon's name, circled twice. Around it, phrases repeated over and over. He must forget. The cycle must begin. Protection through ignorance. And then came the sound. Behind him, the shuffle of footsteps. He turned fast, body tense, ready for anything. Anything but the face he saw in the doorway. Jether.
Alive.
But not afraid. Not confused.
Calm.
And then the real twist dropped like a stone into Gideon's chest. I told you you wouldn't remember, Jether said, stepping forward, eyes locked in sorrow. We made you forget, so it wouldn't hurt. Gideon staggered, unable to form words. Forget what? He finally managed, voice hoarse. That you started this, Jether whispered. You're the one who called it forth. The covenant. The sacrifice. All of it. We tried to stop it. But you made the deal. You sealed the altar with your own blood 3 years ago to protect us all. You begged us to erase your memory. You said the only way to stop the darkness from spreading was if you truly believed you were innocent. The room spun. The memories didn't flood back, not yet, but the feeling did. The weight. The familiarity of the ring. The voice he heard in the cave. The chilling dreams he thought were just fear. They weren't hallucinations. They were fragments. Leftover pieces of a truth buried so deep, it had taken this long just to crack the surface. Now, everything was different. Gideon hadn't just been chosen. He had volunteered. And someone, maybe Jether, maybe his father, maybe something older, had made sure he wouldn't remember until it was almost too late. But what scared him more than anything was the look in his brother's eyes. Because Jether wasn't just there to reveal the truth. He was there to stop Gideon from remembering the rest. Gideon stood in the center of his father's workshop, surrounded by the tangle of secrets and symbols that had once seemed like riddles, but now burned with a disturbing clarity. The truth was no longer hiding, it was staring him down, daring him to do something with it. His brother Jether, the one person he thought had vanished in fear or been taken, was instead standing before him as both a brother and a barrier. Every instinct screamed for answers, but every truth revealed only led to deeper pain. Jether wasn't just a bystander in this dark web. He was part of it. A protector, perhaps. A liar, definitely. And the worst part? He claimed to have done it all for Gideon's own good. You said I chose this, Gideon muttered, the weight of the ring in his palm like a branding iron. That I made this deal. That I what? Sacrifice my memory? My life? For what? For who? The rage trembled in his throat, not as a shout, but as a cracked whisper, one born not just of anger, but betrayal. Jether's expression didn't change. It remained soft, maybe even haunted, like a man carrying guilt too heavy for words. You chose to forget, he said quietly, because you saw what was coming. You knew the village wouldn't survive the truth. You told us that if you remembered too early, you'd try to stop it, and stopping it would cost more than any of us could pay. We didn't want to lose you, Gideon. But you were willing to lose yourself. Gideon stepped back, the ache in his chest now physical, like something sharp had taken root under his ribs. He couldn't believe it, wouldn't believe it. But everything, the scrolls, the symbols, the whispers in the grove, everything had been building toward this. Not a mystery to solve, but a memory to reclaim. And now, with it unraveling fast, He was left with a choice that made his stomach twist with dread. Keep digging and uncover the rest of what he did, what he chose to do, or walk away and let the darkness consume someone else in his place. The decision wasn't theoretical. Jether made that clear. There's one final seal, he confessed, his voice taut with urgency. You left instructions. We're not allowed to break it unless you agree, fully agree, to remember everything. But once it's broken, there's no going back. You'll know what you did, and who you did it to. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that hadn't yet reached them. Gideon didn't ask what Jether meant by who. He didn't want to know, not yet, because some part of him already did. And that part was terrified. Was it Eliab? Was it someone from the village? Someone he had once loved, once trusted, once sacrificed on that hidden altar in the hills? The emotional weight bore down harder than the confusion ever had. Gideon wasn't just fighting shadows anymore. He was confronting his own reflection. Everything felt like it was tilting. He thought of his mother, long dead. Thought of Josh, who must have carried this burden until his final breath. Thought of the villagers, who had whispered of chosen ones and divine plans while living in fear of an ancient curse they didn't understand. And now he was supposed to decide whether to carry it or destroy it. But destruction came with a price, one Jether had no trouble naming. If you break the seal, Jether said, you'll know the full truth. But you'll also trigger what's been waiting. You'll call it out of hiding. You'll become what they feared. And once that happens, you won't just be the one who started it. You'll be the one they blame. The ultimatum was clear. Walk away now. Forget it all. Live safely in the shadows of lies. Or tear off the veil and face the consequences of his forgotten past. Either way, someone would pay. Maybe the whole village. Maybe Jether. Maybe himself. That night, Gideon didn't sleep. He sat on the rooftop beneath the stars, gripping the ring and the sealed box with knuckles white from tension. Everything he thought was real had cracked open like an old wound, and now the scar underneath throbbed with truth. But truth wasn't healing, it was poison when poured too fast. As the sun crept over the horizon, bleeding pale light across the rooftops, a figure approached the house. Not Jether. Not Eliab. A woman, cloaked in gray, face hidden beneath a hood. She walked with purpose, as though she knew exactly where she was going. In her hand, she carried something wrapped in cloth, crimson, just like the ring had been. She said nothing when Gideon opened the door, only stared at him for a long moment before placing the bundle in his hand and whispering, "You weren't the only one who made a deal." Then she turned and vanished down the path before he could speak. And as Gideon unwrapped the cloth, heart pounding, he saw something he never expected. A second ring, identical to his father's, but engraved with a name that made his blood run cold. Not his, not Josh's, but his mother's. And suddenly, the mystery wasn't about him anymore. It was about her, and what she had given up to keep him alive. And now, the story wasn't just unraveling, it was detonating. The moment Gideon saw his mother's name carved into the second ring, everything he thought he knew collapsed in on itself like a burning house. All the half-memories, the whispers of forgotten promises, the strange pull toward the altar and the grove, they weren't signs of destiny. They were traces of a long-orchestrated plan that ran deeper than he'd ever imagined. His mother hadn't died by accident. Her death had been staged. Not in the dramatic, murderous sense the village rumors like to pass around, but in the quiet, deliberate way that people disappear when they know too much and can't risk telling the wrong person. The ring in his hand was proof that she hadn't just known about the covenant, she had been part of it. He stormed back to the workshop, the bundles still clutched in his shaking hand. Jether was there, sitting in silence, as if he had been waiting. But this time, Gideon didn't hesitate. He slammed the ring down on the table. "You told me I made the deal. You said I was the one who called it forth. So tell me why my mother had a ring just like this. Tell me why she was involved." Jether's eyes didn't widen in shock. They didn't show surprise or guilt. Just resignation. As if this moment had always been inevitable. "Because she was the first to make the deal," he said. You weren't the beginning, Gideon. You were the continuation. The floor felt like it tilted beneath him. Gideon gripped the table, trying to keep from losing his balance, his breath, his grip on reality. How many? He whispered, afraid of the answer. Jether closed his eyes. 3 generations. Your grandmother. Your mother.
Then you.
Each one made the sacrifice in secret. Each one passed the burden down without ever revealing the full truth. They believed if the covenant remained hidden long enough, the darkness would stay bound beneath the altar. But it didn't, Gideon spat. It didn't stay bound. It's been clawing at the surface this whole time. Jether looked up, something hard in his voice now. Because you broke the chain. You were never supposed to return to the altar. You were never supposed to remember. That was the only way the village stayed protected. But you. I didn't know. Gideon shouted. You made me forget. No. Jether said firmly, rising to meet his brother eye to eye. You asked us to. You begged us. You knew what remembering would do. Before Gideon could respond, a sudden crash shattered the tension. The front door splintered inward, and figures in black cloaks stormed in. Not strangers. Villagers. Familiar faces twisted in solemn purpose. Eliab led them, no longer the quiet ally whispering warnings. Now he moved with the authority of someone who had waited too long for this moment. He's remembered too much, Eliab said coldly. It's time. Gideon backed toward the far wall, rage and disbelief coursing through him like fire. You were helping me. You said they were hiding something from me. I was helping you understand, Eliab said, his voice void of remorse. So you'd choose the right side before it was too late. But you didn't. You went too far. Now you're dangerous, not just to yourself, but to everyone. Jether stood between them, his voice rising. You don't have to do this. He hasn't remembered everything yet. There's still time. No. Eliab cut in. There's no time. The seal is weakening. The moment he found that ring, it began. The darkness is coming through, and if he remembers the last truth, it will take him like it took the others. And you know it. Gideon's mind raced. He'd spent days chasing clues, unraveling mysteries, thinking he was fighting some distant evil. But the real danger wasn't hidden in the shadows. It was standing right in front of him. The entire village council, the men and women he'd grown up trusting, were part of a silent agreement that had lasted generations. They hadn't just known about the covenant. They had enforced it, guarded it, protected it, not out of malice, but out of fear. Fear of what would happen if it were broken. Now, Gideon was the fracture. He darted for the back exit, barely dodging the grasping hands of the cloaked villagers. Jether followed, shouting instructions he couldn't hear over the roar in his ears. They ran through alleys, over rooftops, into the woods beyond the village border. And all the while, Gideon's thoughts spiraled. His mother. The ring. The hidden altar. The erased memories. It wasn't just a personal journey anymore. He was at the center of something ancient, terrifying, and on the verge of collapsing. When they finally stopped, breathless in a clearing surrounded by ancient oaks, Jether dropped to his knees and pulled something from his cloak. The final seal. A stone tablet marked with symbols Gideon had only seen in fragments, symbols that pulsed now with a faint glow. This is it, Jether said, holding the seal out. This is the last truth. But if you break it, Gideon, there's no going back. Whatever's behind it, whatever your mother gave her life to protect, it will change everything. And not just for you. And then came the voice.
Low.
Female. Familiar. You already know what's behind it, she said. Gideon turned, and his heart stopped. It was her. His mother.
Alive.
And the last thing she said before the darkness cracked through the trees was, You were never supposed to be the warrior, Gideon. You were supposed to be the gate. The forest trembled as if it, too, had held its breath for far too long. Gideon stood paralyzed, staring at the woman who stepped from the shadows like a ghost given flesh. Her face, though marked by time, was unmistakable. His mother, Mara, who had been dead for over a decade, buried with whispered prayers and tear-choked goodbyes. Yet here she was, alive and calm, wrapped in the same crimson shawl he remembered from childhood, the fabric faded but still humming with that strange warmth she had always carried. And though every instinct in his body screamed this couldn't be real, the ache in his chest told him otherwise. This wasn't an illusion. This wasn't a vision born of fear or exhaustion. She was real, and the way she looked at him, torn between pride and sorrow, confirmed what his heart already knew. She had never truly left. Jether fell silent, backing away slowly, like he understood that this was no longer his moment to speak. The final seal pulsed in Gideon's hand like a heartbeat, and Mara's gaze dropped to it before rising to meet her son's eyes again. "You weren't supposed to find this," she said softly, stepping into the clearing, her feet bare against the moss. But the bloodline always knew. Every generation hoped the next would be the last to carry it, but the darkness never sleeps. Gideon's hands trembled. "Why?" he asked, voice cracking under the weight of years stolen from him. "Why did you let me believe you were dead? Why hide all of this from me, from everyone?" Her smile was faint but full of pain. "Because the truth was too dangerous. I made a choice, Gideon. The same one my mother made. To seal the curse, we had to vanish, let the world forget. But when Josh, your father, defied the council and passed the burden to you, everything changed. The covenant was never meant to be broken, but he believed you could survive it. I begged him not to. I told him you were too kind, too soft-hearted, too much like me." And then, as if summoned by the final twist of fate, Eliab and the others emerged from the trees, surrounding them in a silent half-circle. They no longer wore masks of brotherhood. Their eyes were hard now, grim with the knowledge that the end had come. "She broke the seal," Eliab said. "She abandoned the right. She doomed us all." "No," Mara snapped, her voice rising with authority. "You doomed yourselves when you started treating the covenant like control. You turned it into a weapon. It was supposed to protect us, but you twisted it." The tension cracked like lightning, and in that instant, everything Gideon had carried boiled over. The lies, the fear, the stolen memories. The truth screamed in his veins like wildfire, and without thinking, he lifted the seal above his head. Symbols blazed with ancient power, burning white-hot as the truth poured from it, not in words, but in visions that struck everyone present like thunder. Flashes of his mother kneeling before the altar, offering her blood to bind the ancient spirit. Josh standing behind her, hesitant, but drawn forward by love and desperation. Eliab, younger, driven not by faith but envy, watching from the shadows. Then came Gideon's birth, not a blessing, but a consequence. The covenant had marked him from the beginning. And then the real horror. The darkness wasn't meant to be sealed forever. It was meant to choose. The gate wasn't a curse, it was a throne. And Gideon wasn't the one who called the darkness. He was the darkness, born into flesh, his soul split from the shadow to give humanity a fighting chance. But the moment he remembered everything, the moment the seal shattered, there would be no more division. The spirit would reclaim him, and the choice would no longer be his. He dropped the seal as if it had burned his skin. The weight of that final truth nearly crushed him to his knees. "I'm not the warrior," he whispered, his mind reeling. "I'm the key." "No," Mara said, stepping forward, tears streaking down her cheeks. "You're still you. That part was always yours. The darkness is only a part of you. It doesn't have to control you. But you must choose now." Before Gideon could answer, Eliab lunged. The villagers moved in unison, not to fight Gideon, but to silence Mara once and for all. They knew the moment she finished her plea, their grip on this ritual, on this cycle of sacrifice and fear, would end. A scream tore from Jether as he hurled himself between his mother and the blade that came flying through the air, catching it in his side. He crumpled to the ground as chaos erupted in the clearing. Gideon reached for the ring, the one that bore his mother's name, and slipped it onto his finger. The world stilled. The trees fell silent. Even the wind held its breath. And then Gideon spoke, not with rage, but with resolve. This ends now. The earth trembled beneath them, roots twisting, groaning. A great presence awakened in the air around them, and Eliab's eyes widened with terror. "You've summoned it," he gasped. "You've let it in." "No," Gideon said, standing tall, every muscle in his body burning with power and pain. "I've become it." Light exploded from within him, not darkness, as everyone feared, but blinding, searing light that burned away the corruption that had clung to the covenant for centuries. The villagers fell back, shielding their eyes. Mara fell to her knees, weeping, not in sorrow, but in awe. And when the light faded, only Gideon remained standing, the ancient symbols now carved into his skin like molten gold. The danger had passed, but the story wasn't over. As dawn broke over the clearing and the first light touched Jethur's still form, Mara gasped and turned toward Gideon. "There's something else," she said, voice barely a whisper. "The second ring, it wasn't mine." Gideon froze. "What do you mean?" She looked at him with eyes full of dread. "It belonged to your twin." And in that moment, everything shifted again. Somewhere out there, someone else carried the same power. Someone with the same blood. Someone who hadn't been raised to contain the darkness, but to use it. And they were no longer in hiding. The wind carried the scent of renewal across the valley as the sun crept higher into the sky, painting the landscape with soft gold and amber. The forest, once a place of dread and secrets, now breathed with a strange, sacred calm. The curse that had bound Gideon's lineage for generations had been broken, not through force, but through the choice he made to embrace both the light and the darkness within him. He didn't destroy the ancient power, he integrated it, rewrote the covenant through his own sacrifice and will. The pain of his transformation, the weight of the memories, and the trauma of the final battle remained etched into his body like sacred tattoos, but there was a peace in him now that hadn't existed before. The kind of peace born from truth, hard-earned, messy, and irreversible. Jethur had survived, though barely. The wound he took had nearly taken his life, but as Gideon held his hand and whispered the same blessing their mother used to speak over them as children, something ancient responded. Not magic, not miracle, just the resonance of deep, unconditional love that healed what nothing else could. Jethur's eyes eventually opened, filled with pain, but also with a new understanding. For years he'd envied his brother, resented the shadow Gideon unknowingly cast, but now he saw what it meant to carry that burden. They weren't rivals. They were two halves of a greater truth. And for the first time, they wept together not in fear or anger, but in relief. The villagers disbanded the secret council. Some fled in shame. Others stayed to help rebuild, humbled by the revelation that their entire understanding of faith and tradition had been tainted by fear and manipulation. Eliab's fate was sealed, not by Gideon's hand, but by the truth he could no longer escape. Stripped of power, exposed as a manipulator who used ancient fears to control others, he wandered into exile. No prison was needed. His silence would be punishment enough. The others followed Mara, who emerged not just as a survivor, but as a guide to a new way forward, one rooted in knowledge instead of secrecy, courage instead of ritual. But not everything found a neat resolution. The final revelation, that Gideon had a twin, hung in the air like smoke after a fire. There was no name, no trail, no photograph or memory to guide them. Just the ring, identical to the one Gideon now wore, pulsing with the same energy and etched with the same forgotten language. Somewhere out there, a soul mirrored his, a reflection of what he could have become, or maybe what he might still become if the balance tipped. It wasn't a threat, not yet. But it was a reminder. This wasn't just his story. It never had been. Gideon didn't return to the old village. Instead, he built a new dwelling deep within the mountains, where silence was sacred and the nights spoke in whispers. People came to find him, not to worship or fear him, but to listen, to learn, to find their own peace in the truths he unearthed. He never claimed to be a prophet, and he didn't offer easy answers. But his presence alone brought comfort. He carried scars like scripture and bore his past like armor forged in fire. And that, more than any story or miracle, is what people remembered most. Years passed, and the tale of the weakest man who became a mighty warrior grew beyond the borders of his homeland. Some said he died in those woods. Others swore they saw him in distant lands, always walking alone, always watching. But one thing was certain, his legacy didn't end in that final battle. It lived on in every person who chose to face their darkness without fear. In every soul who dared to believe that strength wasn't the absence of weakness, but the willingness to confront it head-on. Gideon had been chosen not because he was the strongest, but because he was honest, broken, human, and willing. And on quiet nights, when the wind curled through the trees and the stars seemed to pulse with hidden meaning, you could almost hear the echo of his mother's voice calling his name, reminding the world that sometimes God doesn't choose the mighty. He makes them. Somewhere, far from the mountains and deeper into forgotten terrain, a fire burned in a small, hidden camp. A figure sat alone, watching the flames dance in the eyes of an identical ring. A twin heartbeat. A whisper of fate. A story not yet told. And so, the legend continues, not with an ending, but with a question. If the darkness lives in all of us, who gets to decide what we do with it? The answer, perhaps, lies within you.